I'm gonna, actually, I find this really fun. Can you hear me? Cannot hear me. But I heard it. Okay, so I'm gonna try to not allow this to distract me too much. So what Sandy laid out was a discussion, a really important discussion about the kind of radical invasion, stripping away of privacy and any kind of confidence in being able to act or speak without necessarily feeling that there is a government which is monitoring those thoughts and words and actions, maybe not thoughts per se, but at least expressed. What I want to do is I want to step back a little bit, and I want to kind of offer a slightly bigger picture. I'm not a lawyer, but I like to pretend that I know something about it. And in particular, here's what I want to talk about, and I think this is also what Sandy was alluding to. In part, after the horrific events of September 11, there was a very interesting, if you will, right, a very interesting series of laws that were passed, but as importantly, what happened less than 6 weeks after September 11, 2001, was that there was a 300-page bill called the USA Patriot Act, which Sandy just mentioned, which was passed. Now, it was passed nearly unanimously. Have you ever known Congress to pass anything unanimously right away? So this is what I want us to kind of think about a little bit, okay? Because in fact, that bill took much more than just 6 weeks to write. Many parts of that bill had taken many years before. They had been put together perhaps in that 6-week period. But the ideas in that bill are really important, and they govern a lot of what I think we need to think about and be concerned about today. Namely, it offers a new idea. It's not so new, but at least for my generation, those who come after me, a fairly new idea. And that idea, I mean, there's actually several of them, but the most important one is what is called preemptive policing. Okay? Now, what preemptive policing is the idea that the state, on suspicion, all it has to do is suspect you of wrongdoing, and it has laid out a space by which to apprehend you, interrogate you, and detain you, right? If not worse. This is what we're seeing. This is what we've seen over the last 12 years. The NSA revolutions that Glenn Greenwald and Sandy's been talking about are part and parcel of that. What that essentially means, and this is the other important principle that has been passed since September 11th, right, that has really become commonplace for us, is that the state is creating a much larger, broader swath of no accountability. This is what we need to be remembering, right? So what this means is, the idea of preemptive policing means that you no longer need a warrant in order to search someone. It means that you no longer need probable cause in order to arrest somebody. You do not have to show proof. Now, what goes hand in hand with this is the idea of legal black holes. Okay? So this is part of the consistent set of practices that has been put into place, initiated, I will grant you, under the Bush administration. And presumably in 2008, some of us actually thought that we were going to have a slightly different regime, a regime change, if you will. And what we've had is definitely a regime change that has pretty much expanded the space of political authority to continue to arrest, detain, and intercept. But not everybody. And I think this is the other thing that we need to keep in mind, is that while the NSA, for example, in fact, listens in on everyone's communications, the people that it affects most of all are those who are the most politically vulnerable. And this is what we have to think about. That it's one thing to have the state spy on you, but if you feel fairly comfortable in your comings and goings, then chances are you feel fairly politically protected. But the other thing that the USA Patriot Act and a series of laws that comes after it, including the National Defense Authorization Act of 2012 especially, a whole bunch of laws, but I'm not going to talk about it. But this one especially, and also the NDAA 2013, which is generally a budget bill, which authorizes what kinds of monies can be spent, right, for all kinds of budgets, military, other kinds of expenditures, other kinds of accounting, has a clause in it. The NDAA has which says that the president and his representatives have the ability to intercept anyone, anywhere, at any time, and detain them for suspicion of being a terrorist. Does that mean that everyone, everywhere, stands to fear? Perhaps. But what it really, immediately, more urgently means is that those who had a shoddy, precarious political standing in this country, but also internationally, are those who stand to fear the most. Why? Is it because those who are Muslim men or Muslim women are automatically worse in content of their character? No, that's not what I'm suggesting. What I'm suggesting is that this is a way by which to argue that racial profiling is legitimate in the name of national security. Now, what this also means is that the constant debate that you will hear and one that the ACLU tries to fight is that in order to protect our security, presumably that means all of us, that we must be willing to give up some set of our liberties, because we cannot protect people if we're stopped, inhibited, blocked by people's individual rights, right? I mean, rights just kind of get in the way. Well, I'm here to tell you that that's kind of the point. Not so much to get in the way of security, but to get in the way of an attitude. And I'm not singling out anyone in the president administration, but it gets in the way of an attitude of infallibility. The idea that the state knows best. That's the purpose of having individual rights. That is the purpose of the Fourth Amendment. That is the purpose of the Fifth Amendment, which guarantees that you shouldn't have to incriminate yourself. That is the purpose of the 14th Amendment, which is supposed to be guaranteeing, and it doesn't say all citizens, although we can debate this all night long. It says all persons. That all persons should have the right to be able to face their accusers. Let me modify that. Should have the right to face the accusations and know the evidence that is there against them. Now, that is so that we can double check the reasons why somebody has been accused of something, of a crime, of a potential terrorist act, of some kind of wrongdoing that has harmed someone else. The idea of a court trial, the idea of having a lawyer to represent you, is to say, is this really based on solid evidence, or is this based on something less than that? Now, it doesn't always work, as we saw in the Trayvon Martin case, there's no doubt. But it is a kind of minimal standard. That's the purpose of rights, at least in the US Constitution. So, when you have the space that has been created since September 11th, since the USA Patriot Act, which allows for the creation, right, of an omniscient state, and by that what I mean is a state which tells you to trust them, that says that they shouldn't be sharing information or evidence with you about why they suspect you, then in effect what that is saying is that there is a whole legal and political and moral world that you don't know enough to be able to share. That is what it means to have a jail, a prison, that is offshore, and yet somehow part of an American military base called Guantanamo. That is what it means to engage in a series of targeted strikes against international citizens in the form of those that killed not just Osama bin Laden and Anwar al-Awlaki, but his 16-year-old son, who was killed on the way to search for his father. And his 16-year-old son, Abdul Rahman, was an American citizen. He grew up in Denver. He loved video games, he loved to play, and he wasn't a part of whatever world the state says that it has evidence about with regard to his father. He was killed in a drone strike. And this is a drone program which, if you look at the May 2012 New York Times and Washington Post, you will find a story in each of them and many other places that talk about a drone program that has literally was started under the Bush administration and expanded exponentially under the Obama administration, which gives itself the space to kill people that they have decided are suspected terrorists. Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki was supposedly a mistake. He was supposedly killed accidentally, but the Obama administration refused to confirm it, and later they insisted it was a mistake. So what we don't know is what the evidence is by which they droned this 16-year-old boy. He was the same age as Trayvon Martin. Now, the other thing that I want to talk about here, briefly, is the other very important policy that has been continued under the present administration, which is of extraordinary rendition, which President Obama claimed to have ended. This was what was going to set him apart from President Bush. What we also know is that as of November of last year, at least one instance of extraordinary rendition is alive and well, right? Is alive. His name is Mahdi Hashi, and he disappeared from Somalia, where he was living. He was 23 years old. He moved to Somalia after having grown up in England. He moved to England with his parents, lived there, and actually filed a complaint with his MP, Frank Dobson. Filed another complaint with a human rights group called Cage Prisoners, that he and a group of his associates, friends, that he grew up with, were part of a social youth organization called the Kentish Town Youth Workers. Were constantly being harassed by the British equivalent of the British MI5, which is the British equivalent of the American CIA. To cooperate with them, to turn, to become spies against members of their community, against members of their mosque. Mahdi Hashi was repeatedly harassed. There are stories dated as far back as 2009 in The Independent, a British newspaper, that talk about him and his friends. So he finally decided, he went off to visit his grandmother, and they would not allow him to visit his grandmother in Somalia. They interrogated him for 9 hours. So he filed another complaint when he came back to England, because they sent him right back. Sometime after that, when it became clear that he was going to be repeatedly harassed, he decided he would just move to Somalia. He got married, he had a child. Now, there's all kinds of other allegations about what he's doing in Somalia. As you know, it's a fairly unstable country. You may also know that Al-Shabaab is an organization that is part of it, that has been apparently responsible for some of the killings that happened in Kenya yesterday. But what we also know is that there is no evidence. He disappeared last June. His family called up the British Home Office and pled for assistance. Said, can you please help us? Our son has disappeared. We're afraid that the Americans took him. And the British Home Office said, well, we would, except that we stripped him of his citizenship about 4 weeks ago. So actually, we have no way to help him. So they stripped him of his citizenship, and this is something that the English government has done, at least under the present secretary, who's been there for 3 years, Theresa May, 18 times. With the exception of one, all of them have been young Muslim men who, when they have left the country to go on a trip, their citizenship has been stripped. Excuse me, I would appreciate it if you would stop me taking photographs. Thank you. And at that point, there was no word whatsoever. Apparently a letter had been sent to him and he had been given 4 weeks to contest it. Well, he disappeared before he was able to contest it. He didn't show up until last December in an American court, a federal court in Brooklyn, where he and 2 others were charged with conspiracy to aid terrorists. Now, for those of you who are lawyers, then you already know that that is one of the weakest charges that you can level against someone because you don't need a lot of evidence. You literally need nothing more than someone to say that they saw something, heard something. So that's what he was charged with. He had two other charges as well. One was aiding a terrorist organization, and the other one was firearms. Apparently in Somalia it's really strange that one would have a firearm when there is no stable government. But that's besides the point. After he showed up, he claimed he was assigned a lawyer, and he pointed out that he'd been tortured in Djibouti for 4 months. The only reason his parents were able to hear about it was because he convinced someone who was in that prison with him who left to smuggle a note to his parents to say, look, I'm being treated very badly. Now this has become a de rigueur practice on the part of the American administration. I follow this for a living, and I can give you case after case after case after case. What does this have to do with us? What this has to do with us is that there is a certain norm that we have become accustomed to, which is called the absence of accountability. The absence of the state having to share with us the evidence that they use, in particular, against Muslim men for why they profile them. It is a domestic practice that we've had for the better part of 11 years. We've seen it in a program called NSEERS, where Muslim men in 2002, all over the country, from 25 countries, were required to register their presence with the FBI, and many of them disappeared for months and months and months. And their families had no way of knowing where they were. This is the same practice that we used during World War II to intern Americans of Japanese origin. And that same policy was dusted off and brought back. It did not end until 2005. The New York stop and frisk policy under Mayor Bloomberg and Ray Kelly has engaged again in the same kind of racial profiling. Not just against African Americans and Latinos, but against Muslim men. There is a CUNY Law School report on the kind of extensive CIA and FBI surveillance of Muslims in cafeterias, in classrooms, in mosques, in college, on campus, literally, which has made Muslims afraid to even speak to each other or to create a community. And as you know, that is the easiest way to create divisions among groups. It is the easiest way to render people vulnerable. Those practices we are now seeing in the international arena because these kinds of things like extraordinary rendition, which just means illegal kidnapping, are now being aided and abetted by the British government. The other famous example of extraordinary rendition, which you may have heard of, happened under the Bush administration. And we thought it was really something that was relevant, specific to the Republicans, was the interrogation at JFK Airport of Mahar Arar, who was a Canadian citizen of Syrian descent. He was coming back, he's an engineer, grew up in Syria, Muslim, and he was literally interrogated for 9 hours. And he said, please, let me call a lawyer, let me call my family. They said, no, we're gonna go, and we're gonna torture you. And he said, well, whatever you do, please don't send me to Syria. They're gonna torture me there. I left a long time ago, please don't do this. So they immediately sent him, I believe, to Jordan and then to Syria, so that the US could credibly claim that they don't engage in torture. They offshore it. It's called military contractors and other countries who do the dirty work. After 10 months of being confined in a cell where he couldn't even stand, he was finally released one day through the efforts of his wife. He's back in Canada. The Canadian government awarded him $10 million and an apology. He's still never received an apology from the US, and he and his family, his entire family, including his children, are on a no-fly list, are banned from the US. And he, at least, has been cleared of wrongdoing. And that was in 2002. So one of the questions that we need to seriously ask ourselves, and I'm sorry, I cannot end on an optimistic note here, but one of the serious questions that we need to ask ourselves is at what point we're going to start pushing back against the kind of systemic, pernicious harassment of people who are That's all I have to say. Thank you very much.